This next video is going to be a little bit more of a serious topic where we start talking about prejudice and discrimination. So, prejudice is a negative attitude toward people based on their membership in a particular group. Now, a lot of times you see prejudice leveled towards people of a particular race or of a particular religion. All of these are different groups that people can belong to, and sometimes prejudice exists where others have a negative attitude toward that specific group. Discrimination happens when you start treating people unfairly based on the group that they belong to. So if you start acting on your prejudice, you are then discriminating against people who belong to that particular group. Now, a lot of times people honestly believe that they are not prejudiced. They don't think that there is anything in them that prejudices them against a particular group. But we run into a lot of hidden biases where you don't even realize it's happening, but the way that the system is set up, the way that we are exposed to the world and the things that we're exposed to, it leads to a lot of unconscious bias and hidden prejudice that we may not be aware of. So it's really important to learn that while there are people who are overtly prejudiced and there are cases of overt discrimination, there's also a lot more going on where people don't realize that they're being prejudiced, where they don't realize that this discrimination is happening. And the more we educate ourselves about it, the more we can try and act to sort of stand against that inherent or hidden prejudice and bias. So to start understanding where this prejudice, whether it's overt or covert, is coming from, we should get at the cognitive roots of this prejudice. Now, a lot of this bias and this way of thinking comes down to how information is presented and stored. So we run into an issue of categorization, where people like to divide things up. We like to categorize things. But when we start categorizing people who are like us and people who are not like us, it starts creating sort of an easy avenue for what's called us-them thinking, where you have different perceptions of in-groups, people who are like you, and out-groups, people who are not like you. And so you start having this bias, this perception of we're better, this group is better, and other groups are not as good. So you can have favoritism towards a group that you're part of, and it slowly evolves towards derogation or putting down of groups that are not your group. And so as groups start pointing out more and more negative qualities that belong to those outgroups, it starts leading you to feel more secure and pride of your own in-group and, fear and negativity towards the outgroup. And as you start viewing another group as an outgroup, then you start thinking of them as more the same. So they, the outgroup, are more similar. They're all alike. You start thinking homogeneity, or oh my goodness, you start thinking with homogeneity. So you start thinking that everyone is the same. It's basically everyone within that group fits my particular view of what that group is. And as you assign more and more negative qualities to that group, you view all of them as having the same negative qualities, and everyone is the same. So as this kind of a view, this us versus them sort of separation gets established, you start to realize that it's fairly easy to care about your own group and start feeling hatred, prejudice, and then eventually acting on it to have discrimination towards other groups, just based on how you frame your thoughts. Now, these prejudices, these stereotypes, can start acting as sort of like a mental shortcut, where as soon as you have a mental image of what a particular group should be like, then you initially know how you should respond to someone who belongs to that group. that's problematic, as we learned when talking about intelligence and how we think about things, where set mental images, our mental sets, are going to sort of lock us into old ways of thinking where we can't adapt and change how we're thinking about things. So it might allow us to make quick responses, but if those responses are based on stereotypes, and if those stereotypes are prejudiced, that's where it starts running over into discrimination. Now, if you encounter someone and you assume, oh, they are part of that group, maybe if you think about science students versus art students, and if you're an art student, maybe you have a preconception about what science students would be like. And if you're a science student, you have a preconception of what art students should be like. But maybe you make a friend in a class and you get to know them and you like them. And then, a couple of weeks in, you realize, hey, you're actually the opposite major from me. You're an arts major, or you're a science major, and I am the opposite. But you don't fit that preconceived notion. You don't fit that stereotype that I had for the opposite group. And so we can start changing our stereotypes, or we can find other ways around it. So if this individual contradicts our preconceived notion, we can either adjust our stereotype for the whole group, we can try and explain this person as an exceptional case. Maybe they don't quite fit the group because they don't fit the stereotype. Or maybe we're going to explain the behavior using situational causes, where, well, they haven't been in a situation where they would act like a stereotypical arts or science major. So there's lots of ways that people start justifying in their brains how this person is different from what they expected. So we can find some ways around the cognitive dissonance of them not quite matching up with what we had expected. Now, before we move on to what's motivating these kinds of prejudice and stereotypes and discrimination and all of this, it's kind of interesting to take a moment and stop and think about how are we measuring and observing and studying these sorts of things. We can look at things like unconscious bias when you have a prejudice that you don't know that you have or you don't think that you have. There are other ways to measure it so that people can't necessarily hide a unconscious bias. Things like word associations. If there's a particular group that we're trying to test if someone has a prejudice against or a bias against, maybe we can do association tasks. So I will show you an image of trying to keep this from being focused on any specific groups, but let's go with cat and dog people. Maybe you're a cat person, and so you would think fondly of people who are cat people, and you think poorly of people who are dog people. And so then maybe you want to start seeing, oh, picture of a cat should automatically be associated with good things. And so if you see a picture of a cat and then a positive word, you can respond faster. But if you see a picture of a dog and the thing that you're trying to match it with is a positive, because that goes against your mental stereotype, it takes you longer to deal with that association. So it's easier to form a link between things that you think that are good and words that are positive and good. And it's easier to form links with things that you think that are bad and words that are associated with bad than it is to cross that preconceived notion. And if we look at response times, we'll see that things that go against your internal biases take longer, and there's a delay in responding. So you can get at these subconscious biases by looking at association studies like that. We can also check things in a little bit more of an overt way, where maybe you show people videos or images of people doing an action, and you tell the participant that this image, this person is part of X group. Maybe they're an arts major, maybe they're a science major. And then because of that preconceived notion, because you've been given information about that group, you might start evaluating what would have been ambiguous behavior as having more meaning to it. So maybe you would change your interpretation of a neutral image to be in line with a stereotype. So if you don't think highly of art students and you're told it's an art student, then maybe you're going to think that that smile is actually a cunning grin, and maybe they've done something and they're feeling smug about it, or something like that. So obviously you can look at these things in much more serious situations. You can look at things like race or religion or sexual orientation, whatever way that people can belong to different groups. There are always examples of these biases existing, whether they're overt or covert, whether they're out in the open or something that's hidden. And so these are different ways to evaluate that. So if we're going to continue talking about prejudices and what's going on here, we might as well talk about motivational roots for prejudice. Where is this coming from? What kinds of situations are fostering this development of prejudice? We're going to talk about two theories, the realistic conflict theory and the social identity theory, to try and figure out what's going on to drive this prejudice. The first, the realistic conflict theory, basically states that competition for limited resources fosters prejudice. If you are actively in conflict for something, and it's either my group gets it or another group gets it, then you might start thinking negatively of that other group because there's the potential that they're going to get something that you don't get. We can go back to our arts versus science majors idea, and maybe there's only a set number of scholarships. And as the competition heats up to get scholarships, maybe you start bad talking the other group. If you're an arts major, you might think, oh, well, the science majors always get preference in these kinds of competitions. It's not fair. They're out to get us. That kind of thinking starts fostering these prejudices and leads to discrimination. In a real world situation, things like socioeconomic downturns, as the economy collapses, acts of prejudice and violence against minority groups tends to rise. So as a recession happens, there tends to be more fear-mongering and hatred expressed towards other people. So maybe you hear people talk about immigrants are stealing our jobs. That's this sort of a setup where there's a competition for limited resources, jobs, and people start framing it as an us versus them mentality. So that's one of the major roots for prejudice. The other one we want to talk about is this social identity theory. And this one's a little bit weird to think about, but it says that this prejudice stems from a need to enhance your own self-esteem. So it's kind of like in middle school, where there's a bully who puts everyone else down, tells everyone else that they're ugly, that they're stupid, that they're whatever, so that they feel smarter and more beautiful and more whatever. So people will start putting down other groups so that they feel better about their own group. So at least I'm not one of X helps you feel better about yourself and whatever group you currently identify with. So you're enhancing your own self-esteem by putting down other people and other groups. Next, we're going to talk about how prejudice can seem to confirm itself. Now, we've already in this class talked about self-fulfilling prophecies, where as you brace for something to be true, you kind of create the situation in which it becomes true. And that works for prejudice as well. So discriminatory behavior can cause others to behave in a way that confirms our stereotypes. Now, the textbook talks about an experiment in the 70s done by Carl Word, where he had set up a situation where primarily white participants were set up to interview in sort of a mock interview fashion, both black and white interviewees, not realizing that the interviewees, the people who were there for the job interviews, were all part of the experiment. They were all trained Confederates who knew what was going on. And when they evaluated the participants' responses, the person who was doing the interviewing, they found that those individuals conducted shorter interviews and made more errors and spoke in uh, in a more negative way to Black people who were interviewing than they did to people who were white. So they found this bias in how our participants were responding to the people who were being interviewed. Now, that's only half the picture. They also set up the experiment so that the people who were participants, the research participants who were coming in to participate in the research, they had them take on the role of the people being interviewed. And this time, they trained someone to act in a way as the interviewer, the person conducting the interview, that matched the behavior they observed in the first part of the experiment. So they would either treat them more negatively, they would speak sort of more negatively, they'd make more errors, they'd conduct a shorter interview, or they would conduct a good interview. And they found that the people who were treated poorly ended up doing more poorly in the interview. So we're seeing that not only is there sort of the driving factor of you can respond to race and have it create a difference in how you're behaving, but that difference in how you're behaving can create differences in behavior for the person that you're behaving towards. So that's a self-fulfilling prophecy where your own behavior can evoke that type of behavior in the person who you're acting against. On the other side of things, we also have what's called stereotype threat, where people who are part of a group that is often stereotyped sometimes have this self-consciousness and a fear that they're going to live up to other stereotypes. So maybe they're so worried that they're going to fulfill a stereotype that they start acting strangely. If they're part of a group and that group has a stereotype that they're very unintelligent, then maybe they're so worried about coming across as unintelligent that they come across as unintelligent. So there's lots of other factors going on here that can drive and help confirm prejudices and stereotypes. So with all of that negativity and all of that going on, how can we even start reducing discrimination? And one of the ways that the textbook focuses on is called equal status contact, where basically you set people up to closely interact with those people that they would discriminate against otherwise. Have them work together in sustained close contact. Have both parties have equal status. So both groups are treated in the exact same way. No one is superior, no one is inferior, everyone is equal. And if you work together to achieve a common goal, especially when that requires cooperation, you start having this shift in how they view the other group. And this is all helped if there is a broader social norm to act normally, to do your job, to work together. So if you can kind of subvert some of the prejudice and bias and force people to work together and see each other as individuals, you can start coming out against this discrimination and support people to work together just as people and not as two competing groups.